So first of all, let's introduce Brad. Brad is the Vice President of Public Policy and Legal Affairs for Michigan Realtors. And Brian Westron is General Counsel for Michigan Realtors. Thanks, guys, for joining us today. And we're glad it's under much different circumstances than we would have been last week. You guys talked this morning kind of about what you're sending out today and what we can look forward to going forward. So if you want to start, Brad, and then we'll move over to Brian, that would be great.
Certainly. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everyone, for having us on. We did get very good news from the governor on Friday. It was a very long road to get there, but we are glad we are here. In all of the time that we were working on your behalf with the governor's office and with the various state departments that oversee our license and the real estate buying process in general, we stressed the need to go back to work, but go back to work in a very responsible manner. So the one thing I just want to remind everyone is that, the governor's executive orders are still very much the law of the land at this point in time. I know the legislature is going to be taking a case to court to see if that is going to be the way it is. But for right now, the executive orders and the state of emergency are allowing the governor to operate without the legislature until a court says otherwise. So very blessed to be going back to work as of May 7th, but at the same time, what the governor has given, the governor can take away. So it is responsibility that we all have as an industry to show that we can do this safely, and we can protect both the health of our clients and as well as the public as we move forward. So beginning on May 7th, we will have not a return to business as usual per se, but a return to business under limited circumstances. The order itself is rather broadly written, so it does provide that real estate services can or be allowed to resume under the executive order, but it provides guidelines for showings, both residential and commercial. Brian will talk a little bit more about some of the additional things that we're going to be adding to those guidelines as best practice recommendations, not mandates, but best practice recommendations. But I did want to get into it and kind of discuss at least the big three questions that we have coming out of the governor's executive order that was issued last Friday afternoon. First and foremost is one, can I still qualify for the pandemic unemployment assistance? The answer is yes. Actually, we have some updated UIA questions that will be going out this afternoon as well. The pandemic unemployment assistance, as passed under the CARES Act by Congress, as understood by NAR, as understood by us, and discussed with UIA, just because the governor has said you can resume work activity, you are resuming work activity that is limited. In other words, it's not the way you usually do business. And you are also resuming work activity in an environment that is very much still being impacted by the pandemic. And that's another thing I want to stress. Just because you can resume some of these real estate activities, please keep in mind, when I talked about being responsible, we still have a pandemic going on. This has not ended COVID-19 in Michigan by any stretch of the imagination. So yes, you should still be able to qualify for PUA. We have some clarifications that are going to go up on the website about how to report commissions that you are receiving because the department kind of changed its tune in terms of how to report those. So we have some clarifications that are going to go up this afternoon as to how to report the commissions earned during the time you're receiving assistance. The other one that we are getting a lot of is, does this mean I can reopen my real estate office back up? That one, under the order, there is still a written broadly, yes, you can reopen your real estate office, but under the order, people in Michigan are still required to do things as remotely as possible. There are further requirements that if you are going to open up your place of business to the public, what you need to abide by. There are a certain number of criteria found in the executive order that businesses that are opening up need to subscribe to if they are going to make themselves open to the public. So if you're going to flip on the open sign, you're going to leave the door unlocked and welcome people who walk in off the street, you're going to have a whole other set of rules that you're going to implement. Our encouragement is at this point in time, it would probably be best to abide by the rules of, is that person absolutely required to be there? Do they have to go there for some necessity? You know, whether it's grabbing forms, signing a contract, maybe meeting with a client, but if it can be done virtually, again, that's encouraged. You know, back office staff preparing things for closing or listings, that type of thing that where you absolutely need to go into the office, you can still do that. The last question we are getting is with regard to residential real estate that is occupied by a tenant. You will notice that under the governor's executive order, it lists the types of properties that can be shown in person right now. As we worked through this, we started pointing out to the governor's office what neighboring states were able to do and how we would be able to operate safely under some of those guidelines. If you look at the way our executive order is written, it is kind of a combination of Illinois and Washington. And the Illinois provisions very much are the same way as ours in terms of this governor is very interested in terms of protecting tenants. We already have residential eviction prohibition by executive order, and she's very much interested in keeping people in their homes whenever possible. So you will see that tenant occupied residential property is not allowed for an in-person showing at this point in time. But if it's vacant, unit, you can definitely show a vacant unit. If the owner is occupying the unit, you can definitely show that, but there are no exceptions at this point in time made for tenant occupied residential property. Just to kind of touch on some of the other things that we are working on outside of the executive order in terms of questions that have come up. A year and a half ago, we worked really hard to pass legislation that allowed for electronic and remote notarization of documents. One of the early victories that we scored with the governor's office was to pull that law forward to make sure that more people could do this without necessarily having the approved Secretary of State software. That executive order, the original one, expires tomorrow night, just before midnight, 11:59 p.m. So we are working on an extension to that executive order with the Department of Finance and Insurance Services to say that notaries, if they choose, can follow the prescribed procedures within the executive order to do both remote and electronic notarizations of work, and that Register of Deeds can accept those as good as a wet signature document. The other thing that we are working on is in regard to the principal residence exemption. What we've stressed to the Department of Treasury is that the normally busy spring market was really set back about a month and a half. We did have deals that closed, but nowhere near what would have closed should in-person real estate activities be able to occur. And so we are working with the Department of Treasury to see if there's a solution to be had in terms of either pushing that filing deadline or creating some sort of mechanism by which if people end up paying the non-homestead rate on their July tax bill, that there might be some sort of refund mechanism. It'll be, each solution brings its own kind of set of additional questions and concerns, but we are working with Treasury on that right now as we speak. So those are some of the other things that we have going on in terms of policy, but important to note, a lot of people are requesting the new forms, the new guidelines, the new FAQs. Those are all going to be hitting your email inboxes here very early this afternoon as part of the Reopening Real Estate Toolkit. And to describe more of the toolkit before we answer some of these questions, I'm going to kick it over to Brian.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for having us. The biggest thrust of the toolkit, I think, is obviously to make sure realtors have what they need out in the field. But really, I think the overarching concern should be really couched in this idea that buyers and sellers not only need to feel comforted by the protocols that we're all putting in place, but they also appreciate the risk that's still very, very present. And, I know that there's going to be an inclination to, jumpstart and get out there and conduct business as usual. But as Brad mentioned, this is not the case. Some of the things that we want to be very mindful of is, with best practices, making sure that buyers agents and listing brokers are cooperating to make sure that private showings and appointments are not overlapping to the point of we got a block of cars down the road. And I think that that's the optic we want to avoid. The governor, as Brad mentioned, can certainly revisit the general nature of the executive order. I think she's very much intended for real estate practitioners to take this very seriously and make sure that this doesn't create more chaos um, than we've already seen out there with people disobeying the order. So we want to make sure that people are mindful of this, that they're obviously taking to heart what's in the toolkit, but also taking it to their clients, because I think that's really the message that's key, is that the clients understand how seriously we're taking this, and they're going to be comforted by that and more comfortable actually proceeding. Some of the best practices that we've talked about, obviously making sure that we're staggering times for appointments, but also making sure that sellers understand that when they do open up their home to a buyer, prospective buyer should say, that all the lights are on, all the windows are open, all the blinds are open, the doors are open. Anything that they can do in preparation for a visit that takes away the necessity for somebody that's visiting their home to touch surfaces, that's a key. And that's something that we've seen around the country with other realtor associations that have been working. The other piece that, I think that is key as you communicate the value to your member or to your client is, if I'm a buyer and I'm visiting the property, I also want to make sure that I'm not there any longer than I need to be, and that we take our conversations and our critique of the property back offline, and we do work remotely as much as possible, because that is still a requirement under the order. We shouldn't just view this as a way to open things up to the extent that we ignore that. It's one of the lead requirements under the order that we still do remote work as much as possible. Some of the things that we can do remotely, obviously, providing those marketing materials, providing as much information as we can to a prospective buyer up front to make sure that buyers who are visiting and scheduling private appointments are serious buyers. We don't necessarily like to air quote serious buyers because of some of the things that could mean in a more dubious sense. But we're talking about things like financial approval, and that they've actually seen this house in more detail and have narrowed it down in their search. The idea of just going out and looking at properties without sort of a foundation for what property they're visiting seems counterintuitive to the order and some of the best practices that we're putting forward. Some of the other things I want to make you aware of in the document that's going to be going out, the Reopening Real Estate Safely Toolkit, we will have a showing addendum that will have hold harmless language for the brokerage and the realtor and the cooperating realtor. And then we will also have a buyer certification that will ask the buyer to certify, obviously, that they've assumed risks and also that they are certainly not aware of any lingering COVID-19 details or diagnoses or concerns there. Those are going to be important. They've also very much mirror the type of questions that you would be asked by your local health department, and also realtor associations around the country have been employing similar forms. The notion of a hold harmless agreement, as we've said repeatedly, we don't necessarily think there is a silver bullet to any of these things, but we want to make sure that when we do put forms out there, we're putting forms out there that not only create eyes wide open perspective for the clients, but also in the body of those forms, create another way to get those best practices to the seller and the buyer. That's really one of the key things, and I think a duty that realtors have is to make sure that they're putting this in front of their clients to make sure that the risk is understood and that the best practices are being employed, because they are not necessarily all mandated in the order. Things like masks, things like use of gloves, those are best practices that are strongly recommended. And I think that buyers need to understand that sellers can require them as a condition of actually showing the property. The FAQs, as Brad mentioned, are updated. We tried to get at the heart of the questions we started to receive right out of the gate on Friday when real estate was, in fact, opened up, at least message for May 7th. And things like, can I attend a closing? Obviously, real estate has been resumed. There's no direct prohibition from attending a closing, but I think it's very important that as realtors work with title companies, that title companies lay the groundwork for whether that's necessary, because we still have to go back to the point that all work that can be done remotely should be done remotely. So based on the complexity of a particular transaction, a title company may feel that it makes sense to have the realtor there in person. But again, we know that those businesses that operate in person have to have protocols in place, social distancing and other mitigation measures that I think we need to take the lead from those groups as settlement service providers to make sure that you're making a decision that's really based on need as opposed to something that you're just used to doing. Any other questions that we've seen? Obviously, oh, Brad, go ahead.
There's one here that says, can we pick up our signs, key boxes from closed listings? Yes. As I mentioned, under the order, real estate activity is allowed to resume. So this doesn't just include collecting signs and lock boxes, but it also includes installing signs and hanging lock boxes. So those are allowed.
But also to clarify that, Brad, they shouldn't be putting signs out today because they're not allowed to work quite yet.
Not
right?
until, right. Not until May 7th.
Midnight tomorrow.
Yeah.
So if you want to be
1 a.m., you can go and get a post hole digger and drop a real estate sign.
It's not going to raise any eyebrows.
So we have a couple more questions. One of them, all listings should have the sellers sign a COVID-19 questionnaire before listings go live and updated as needed. Can this be requested so all buyers know they are safe as well?
So the showing addendum will be incorporated into the listing agreement. So the one that will have to be repeatedly executed will be the buyer certification. The buyer certification, every time I look at a property, I need to execute it. I know it's tedious, but I think that the reality of that form is that it should constantly reinforce the risks associated and that the buyer is keeping track, one day at a time of the ability to go out and look at property. I think if I understood correctly, the question was also sort of a suggestion that they would like to have further language provided by a seller. There certainly are additional things you can do. We believe that the two forms that we're putting out are sort of the more meaningful ingredients to make sure that not only has the seller consented to the showing, they've also assumed the risk and they hold harmless the brokerage and the cooperating broker as well. And on the buyer side, that they're making sure that the buyer is aware of what the seller's requirements are going to be. If the seller is going to require that masks and booties and gloves are used, that's a key communication tool right there.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. What about the COVID-19 extension addendum, which speeds up the process, not extended? I'm not quite sure what that, maybe you guys have a better understanding of what that question's asking.
So before we were resumed, we had two forms. We had a listing agreement extension, and we also had a purchase agreement extension. And that one still may be viable in as much as closings that for whatever reason may be subject to obstacles and timing issues. So to the extent that you have a binding purchase agreement and you just need to extend the closing, you can use that purchase agreement addendum or amendment, I should say. But the other piece is the listing side. If the listing needs to be extended, you can use that. But again, note that some of these things will be moot points because you can start interacting interpersonally now, to the extent that remote work is not enough.
Okay, we have another question here. Could public health departments help as they are the tracers of the virus?
Help in which way?
Yeah, I'm
Well,
not sure.
It is important to note that local governments, have not been preempted by this order. So right now we haven't seen any in particular that have said that real estate restrictions are going to be more severe than what is in the order. But I do think that it's important, as you work with your local governments and your local health departments, that you make them aware of the mitigation measures and the best practices that you're employing. Because I think once they do have a sense of what you're doing and your sellers and your buyers have been informed upon, I think that takes away the idle hands theory of pushing things that are more restrictive.
I think
I-
there was some clarification that says that
It
they
looks
could,
like
the health
contact-
departments could help by letting us know the exposed people.
It looks like what Lori's talking about is contact tracing, which is something that the state of Michigan has attempted to do, and a lot of people are trying to do. I don't know the reliability of it at this point in time. I mean, the state actually, as you may have read the headlines, got rid of the service that was doing the contact tracing for them. And I don't know that it's been replaced, but I'm not entirely sure that you place the reliability on the tracing that's been done by the local health departments. They are doing their best, but the best way to ensure that you are protected when doing a showing is to use the addendum so that the prospective buyer certifies that they have, met the following criteria. The other one talks about that the PUA may end on May 7th. That is not what our contact at UIA has told us. We've noticed there's a pattern sometimes within UIA of people providing conflicting information. But that is one that our contact has said that it should not end. That is not the way other states have interpreted it. We've had 48 other states that have been allowed to do some sort of in-person real estate business before us. And those states are certainly granting the PUA benefits to their folks. Just because you're allowed to go back to work doesn't mean that you're going to have a closing within the next week or 2 or 3 or 4. So our understanding in the way that Congress and NAR and Michigan Realtors has interpreted it, and the way we are going to argue for it, should UIA attempt to enter it, is that there is nothing that prohibits you from collecting the PUA benefit under the CARES Act.
One of the other things that was brought up was the number of people that are allowed in a showing. And the EO says 4, correct? And that means 4 total. That doesn't mean 4 plus the agent, correct?
Right.
Okay. And that would hold true for inspections as well?
4 on the premises, correct.
Yep.
Okay.
Be lucky. There are states that only allow 2.
Yeah. So what would the best practice be if a agent has somebody show up with 4 or 5 people?
They probably to remain in the car.
Yep.
And have those folks who are absolutely necessary to see the home be the ones that are in attendance at the, I would stress that upon setting up the closing, or I'm sorry, setting up the showing, that only those needed to attend should be in attendance for the showing.
Yeah. And I think that's really the key. But Brad's mentioning is, making sure that your clients approach this with all the data that they have, that they understand that the limitation is 4, and that they understand that there's going to be a possibility that the seller's in the home. And those types of things are all variables that I think, from a value add for a realtor to be able to communicate that in advance to the buyer, in communication with the seller's listing agent, is going to be key, because we don't want to have those situations where we have, a crowded lawn or a cars lined up down the road, because that will kind of prove the negative that we're we're not taking this seriously and not cooperating or communicating in an efficient manner.
Yeah, everything that it's not business as usual, and I would argue that everything that has been given up to this point is probably better than we had. I noticed that we had a question pop up. No open houses, no in-person open houses are allowed under the order, and I think that is something that you will see across pretty much every state that allows for in-person real estate to occur. It's because again, it sticks with the stay-at-home order in terms of not having a big concentration of people in one place at one time.
Right. And
So I think there's one more comment about tenant occupied properties. Can you just talk about that one more time? The tenant occupied properties and the showing, whether or not showings can happen in tenant occupied properties.
yeah, I think the distinction I would make, and I think from Lisa's comment, really the difference that this governor makes is, you get into landlord tenant rights and the comfort level. I understand the authorization might be granted, but in our legal FAQ, we're going to stay within the framework of what the order says, and then advise anybody who's attempting to rely on the authorization of a tenant to seek counsel, because I think that while there are various circumstances out there that might be common sense and maybe say, oh, why wouldn't you allow that? We don't want to operate in those gray areas of the order. And I think that anybody who's contemplating that, and if the renter agrees, they should take that offline and work with counsel to make sure that the necessary precautions and possible paper have been executed.
And that you're following your lease agreement.
Mm-hmm. There was one question there about that the agency was going to allow only one person and no children. I would be very careful about, obviously, the language you use for fair housing purposes. But at the same time, I do think that it's important to communicate that, individuals, we have a cap at 4 individuals that need to see the property versus, couching it in terms of familial or any kind of protected classification, because I think that the executive order does the work when it comes to capping the number.
So are those things that are addressed in your best practices, Brian?
Yes.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Great.
And a lot of these questions are part of the FAQ as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I don't see any more questions on here, and it doesn't look like there are any more questions on Facebook. Nope. Well, one just popped up.
Are there disclosure requirements if there's a confirmed case of COVID-19 in a real estate firm? Meaning the agent, or I think the key here is when we talk about seller's disclosure, we have an environmental section that you would probably point to if you had a property that had been exposed to COVID-19. But again, you really, under the common law, would disclose things that create an immediate risk or reasonable risk. And a lot of this is going to be depending on timing, right? I mean, if you don't want to stigmatize a property that had a case, 3 months ago that has been mitigated. I think that it's going to be very much scenario specific. We are addressing disclosure questions on a case-by-case basis for that reason. But in terms of a real estate client, yeah. So can we have health symptom questionnaires? I think you would do better to operate within the scope of the forms. HIPAA is something that it binds healthcare professionals and medical professionals, not real estate professionals. But we still do have concerns under fair housing and ADA law. We've tried to be in lockstep with the language used in health orders and other real estate associations around the country, because I do think that there is a unprecedented nature to this, that people do have to keep, COVID-19 exposure at the forefront of their resumed activities. But that being said, the use of questions that get outside of that kind of uniform capacity, I think that starts to signal a little bit of concern.
For brokerages and offices that wanted to have an office policy, NAR has put out some office policy guidance that I think would be very helpful if you were looking to establish something internally.
All right. I think that wraps everything up. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brian, for taking the time to meet with us
one
today.
more.
We appreciate it.
So, Mary, the toolkit will have the showing addendum that can be utilized for landlords, in the sense that as we know, there are limitations on leasehold showings, but if it's vacant or it's owner occupied, the showing addendum would operate the same way.
All right. I think that wraps it up. You guys, thank you so much. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this for us today. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
All right.
Thank you for having us. I'm glad we were able to share good news.
Thank you, Brad and Brian. On behalf of all of our members, we appreciate all the hard work that you guys have done over the past 6 or 7 weeks. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.